Now, at this point, I find myself wondering, how juicier is this brisket compared to my first brisket? I can't really remember. Hey, what's up everybody? I'm Tony G. You're watching 1526 Barbecue. Today, we're gonna be injecting a brisket with some Wagyu beef tallow. Check it out. All right, everyone probably already knows that when you're learning to cook barbecue or learning how to cook a specific cut of barbecue, in this case brisket for me, you should really only change one thing at a time. Changing too many things in your equation or too many variables in your cook makes it really hard to tell what makes a difference. I knew that going into this cook, but I didn't follow those instructions. So there are a couple things that I did differently on this cook. The first thing I did differently was I left more of that fat cap on the top of the brisket. Now I meant to the last time I cooked a brisket, but it was my first time trimming one, so I did a lot of mistakes and cut it all the way off in many areas. So on this brisket, I actually was able to leave a good amount of the fat cap, maybe a little too much, but you know, practice makes perfect. The second thing that I did differently on this cook was the way I set up the smoker. So if you saw my first brisket cook, I was really concerned about that centralized heat in my pellet smoker on the Pit Boss 1100 Pro. Right in the center is where that fire pot or the ash pot is, so that's the hottest area on the grill. What I did last time to try to negate some of that extra heat was lay down some of the trimmings, some of the fat trimmings of the brisket down first, and then the brisket on top of that. What I did differently this time was I found an aluminum pan that was wide enough or long enough to fit my brisket. I put that right in the center of the barbecue, and then I laid some cooking grates on top of that and my brisket on top of the grates. Now what this does is gives you equal heating under the brisket, right? So as that fire rages in the fire pot, it's gonna heat that water to a certain temperature, and that entire body of water will be at that temperature, and then that will help keep your cooking consistent on the brisket. All right, so for the rub, I'm keeping it the same as I did last time. Salt, pepper, garlic, or SPG. 1 part salt to 1 part pepper, and about a half a part of garlic is what I put on it. Now don't forget to coat the top, the bottom, and all the sides of your brisket. All right, now that we have our brisket with our SPG rub on it, it's time to inject it with our beef tallow. So anytime you're injecting, or anytime I'm injecting any of my barbecue meats, I always take whatever I'm going to inject into the meat and put it in a separate container. You never know how much you're going to use, and you don't really want to contaminate the whole product or the whole container, in this case the whole Wagyu beef bucket. So I took about a half a cup, maybe 2/3, put it in a bowl or a plastic container, and I'm going to be injecting from that plastic container. Now my first attempt to inject, I left the tallow at room temperature. I noticed really quickly that really wasn't going to work. It was too thick. It was almost like a mayo consistency. So I took that container, the small plastic container, over to the microwave, that one, and I ran it for about 20 seconds or so. You don't really want the tallow to get hot. You just want it to liquefy. So it's like just above room temperature. Now, with the tallow at room temperature, it was super easy to inject it. I was able to get all of my separated tallow, the roughly 2/3 of a cup, into the brisket. You can see in the video there's some spots where, while I was injecting, some of the tallow came out, and that's okay. If you've ever injected any kind of meat, you know that happens sometime. It's not a big deal, don't worry about it. Just as you're injecting, if you see it squirting out of another place on the brisket, it's time to either stop, or you can try to plug that hole with your finger while you inject just a little bit more. But that section that you're injecting has enough of the injection, so move to another spot. All right, now that we have our brisket seasoned with our dry rub and injected with our tallow, it's time to get the pit up to temp. I wait on purpose for a brisket to wait until after I have the rub on it to start up the pit. That way the brisket has time to rest on the counter. It's a big, heavy chunk of meat that's really cold, right? It's been in your refrigerator. So you're gonna wanna give it some time to come to room temperature or to just kind of warm up a little bit. My first brisket, I left it on for about an hour on the counter before I cooked it. This one was only on the counter for about 40 minutes. All right, keeping to the theme of the video, I'm not gonna try to bore you with all the step-by-step what happened to my brisket. I will tell you this. We cooked until we had an internal temp of about 170 degrees, 175, unwrapped. Now, this brisket took exceptionally long. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just a different animal, so it took longer. Maybe the Wagyu beef tallow inject caused it to take longer to reach internal temp. Maybe it was partially frozen in the middle. I did buy it just the night before at the store, so I don't know if they ship them frozen or not, but this brisket took forever to cook. Okay, so once we hit our internal temp of somewhere between 160, 175, you'll hit that stall. That's when I wrap my briskets. Again, this is my second brisket, but that's when I've been wrapping my briskets. So I pulled it off the smoker, and when I went to wrap it in my butcher paper, just like in my first brisket, I coated the bottom of the butcher paper with some more tallow, put the brisket down, and then coated the rest of the brisket with even more tallow. Now once I've wrapped it back up, back to the smoker it goes. We're gonna be smoking until we get an internal temperature of about 200 degrees. Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago, this brisket took forever. Total cook time was like 20 hours. So the last 4 or 5 hours where I was just holding at the pit, I'd even bumped the temperature up from 225 to like 250, and I really wasn't seeing any change in internal temp. I decided to turn the smoker off and just put the brisket into the oven. Now, before I put it in the oven, I did put it on a cooking tray because I fully expected there to be a lot of juice coming out of this brisket, or a lot of liquid. So make sure you do that if you bring it inside. So after the 20 hours of total cook time, we finally hit our internal temp right around 200 degrees. At this point, it was time to take it out of its original wrap. I wanted to put it in some good dry butcher paper so that it can rest on the counter for a while. Now look at that tray, that cooking tray that we added under that brisket. The thing is filled to the brim with juice. I'm willing to bet that that's that inject that we put into it. It just created this wonderful tallow pool. Now it was so full that it almost spilled, so I had to be very careful. But I was able to get it out of that packaging, put it in some new butcher paper, and let it rest on the counter till it hit an internal temp of about 180, 185 degrees. What you're trying to do here is let the brisket rapidly cool down to stop the cooking process before you put it in the cooler. All right, so once we hit our internal temp that we were looking for, it was time to let it rest in the cooler. Now, the last time I smoked the brisket, I let it rest for like an hour and a half. This time, because the brisket took so long to cook, the rest period was only 45 minutes. You'll notice when I cut it open, it's still kind of steaming hot. That's why. I would love to have let it rest for an hour, but you gotta eat. Okay, we're gonna get to the juicy parts in just a second. I just wanted to show you one of the cuts from the flat. It was a very, very tender, folded over, no problem. It was able to hold its own weight. It tore apart really easy. All right, let's get to the point, right? Get to the point. All right, so just separating the point from the flat, you can see how much juice is in this thing. It is amazing. Even before I cut the point in half, look at all that fat down there at the bottom of the brisket on the cutting board. This thing is gonna be delicious. Cutting the point in half really opened up the floodgates. We got a ton of fat coming out. Look what happens when I cut this slice. I mean, this thing is so juicy. Now, at this point, I find myself wondering, how juicier is this brisket compared to my first brisket? I can't really remember. My first brisket was delicious. So I pulled up some old footage. Now you can see that there's an obvious difference between this brisket, the first brisket, and our second brisket, today's brisket with the beef tallow inject. All right, I know what you're thinking. Tony, this isn't a valid test. You changed too many variables. Calm down, I get it. Listen, we're all humans. I added a water pan because it's a no-brainer. You should have definitely done that the first time, and I will be doing that from now on. I did the beef tallow inject, and I will definitely be doing that again. This thing was extremely moist. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. We'll see you next time.